So, I'm Brett Jenks. I'm the president and CEO of Rare. I was here just a couple hours ago, and we have a new friend and guest for you. This is Cass Sunstein. How many of you have heard of Cass Sunstein? So, anybody who thinks about collegiate squash knows that Cass has been on the circuit for a number of years. Anybody who has a mild interest in behavioral science or nudging, you might have heard of Cass's bestseller, Nudge, very simple title. So I'm going to ask you a few questions, and we're going to hand it over to the audience. But I just want to say thank you for coming today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks to you.
So my first question is, how jealous were you when Richard Thaler won the Nobel Prize?
Well, I was more jealous when Rami Ashur won the professional squash title. You all know about that. That was a crushing moment for me. When Thaler won the Nobel, it was a thrilling moment, and he's actually, you want to hear a secret? He's a great guy. Who knew?
All right, so we're going to start off with some easy ones, and we'll work our way up to test your mettle. So it's been 10 years since the publication of Nudge, maybe going on 11. What is a nudge, and what's your favorite nudge?
A nudge is an intervention that preserves freedom of choice, but steers people in directions that make their lives go better. So think of a GPS device as a nudge, where you can say, I want to go the scenic route, or I have a route that is familiar and fun for me. Or you can say, I plugged in the wrong destination, so I'm really going to ignore you for that reason. A nudge is like a calorie label or a reminder or a warning or a bit of information about something. My favorite nudge of those that exist right now is a policy from the Department of Agriculture that automatically enrolls poor children who are eligible for free, nutritious school meals in programs that give them those meals. Before the direct certification program, as it's called, the parents had to sign them up, and a lot of them didn't. And we have in the United States now, in a not especially good year, 8 or 9 million children automatically enrolled. I say not especially good because that's phenomenally good. In a year where there's a lot, it can be up to 11 or 12 million. And that means kids all over the United States are getting what they're legally entitled to, not through anything other than just saying, if we know you're eligible, you're in.
Great example. Awesome. So lots changed in the last 10 years, especially in this field. If you look back 10 years, what's changed since Nudge?
Probably the most important thing is in the area of environmental protection and sustainability. We've seen a worldwide explosion of creativity, both in terms of thinking things through and in terms of actual practice. So there are hotels all over the world that say, and this is a small thing, but they say, we're not going to wash your towels every day unless you want us to. And that's a nudge about conserving energy. There are governments all over the world that are giving people information about things that are environmentally relevant. When you buy a new car in the United States, there's a sticker, and it's going to tell you stuff about the environment as well as the economics. And that explosion of inventiveness, which is having real impacts in saving lives by reducing air pollution and in saving money by reducing expenditures, let's say, on fuel-inefficient cars and refrigerators, and in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, that's been inspiring and stunning to see.
Would you say that how big is the gap, though, between this inspiring beginning, some of these new examples, and just given the size of the problem we're talking about today, how much more room is there?
I'd say in terms of the gap between where we are and where we want to be, if a gap of 10 is like impossibly large, we're probably around 6 or 7. So we got a big gap. There's a slogan which some people in the White House have had in recent years, which is whenever something seems really dauntingly large and people say, what are we going to do? The slogan in response is, better is good. So the fact that we're at 6 or 7 now rather than a 10, that's a phenomenal achievement in a short time. So there's a great deal to do. Every bit counts, so I'll give you a number. It's called the social cost of carbon. We're going to get a little wonky for a moment. The social cost of carbon reflects the damage done by a ton of carbon emissions. The latest kind of state-of-the-art number from government circles is about $40. Many people think that's too low, but let's go with $40. If you multiply $40 times even a relatively modest measure to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we're talking in terms of monetary equivalents of a lot. And that won't stabilize the global warming by, let's say, 2100 at 2 degrees Celsius. It won't have that effect, but it will reduce the damage done by climate change. And that means real people will live who would otherwise die, or will have access to things that they would otherwise not have access to, and that in some parts of the world there's going to be ecological stability that there wouldn't otherwise be. So the fact that the problem's so large is best met by having in the front of the mind, better is good.
So speaking of the White House, when you were working under Obama, and you were working with the EPA to put together a relatively comprehensive greenhouse gas reduction strategy, you guys came up with $40 or $45 as the per ton social cost of carbon. If we were to continue to utilize that, what's the potential value of having that number? And if you happen to be, let's just say the czar, the behavior change czar for a week, how would you use that number, and what, given your toolkit and the toolkit of many in this room here, what would you suggest?
Okay, so the potential, I was an English major, not a math major, but so the number is 40 or 45 times, the English majors, we use the word zillion, so it's 40 zillion. So we're talking about many, many billions of dollars, hundreds of billions. We might be in the trillions in terms of the potential savings, but a lot. In terms of what to do with that number, if you're going to use the number, for each of us in our private capacity, or if we're working with governments or the private sector, to embed that number into our judgments about what to do is a really good idea. And there are companies all over the world that are, because of either reputational interests or moral commitment, they are saying, let's consider greenhouse gas emission reductions as a win. And how much of a win? Well, we'll monetize it. But even if you don't monetize it, to see it as a win that's part of what it means to be, a citizen of your country or a participant in civic life, that can be a big motivator. Let me tell you something that I think signals the link between emissions and behavioral science, and it's a little tale that a very large company, Pepsi, has a product called Pepsi Max, which is phenomenally successful in Europe. Notice it's called Pepsi Max, not Diet Pepsi. And I think that's a clue about something really important, that Pepsi Max, you think, Max, that's going to be fantastic. And then you might think also, and no calories and no sugar. Diet Pepsi, there's a little bit of thought, maybe, I'm on a diet. It's kind of punitive. Pepsi Max, I'm celebrating. So what I think is a kind of behavioral link between greenhouse gas emissions and behavioral science, if the approach to greenhouse gas emissions seems promising, part of an assortment of strategies that actually help real people on the ground, then it looks more like Max than like diet. And that can be a big motivator of behavior on the part of people who would otherwise think, I don't really want a diet.
So it's like someone said to me yesterday, we need to be much more in this movement about what we're for, not what we're against. So we're for getting maxed out with our carbonated drinks?
Well, to think of fuel-efficient cars, and I happen to have a relatively fuel-efficient car, a hybrid, it's fantastic for 1,001 different reasons, one of which is you don't have to go to the gas station so much. That's good. It doesn't feel like punishment that I have a car that I don't have to go to the gas station with very often. And the fact is there are opportunities for things that are good for the planet that have exactly that quality. If you have an energy efficient set of appliances in your home, that's a bonus. You're not spending as much money every month. And after a while, that amount of money accumulates. So there's an idea that's very contested in government circles. It's called co-benefits. And the idea is you have a program that, let's say, is reducing air pollution, but at the same time, it's, let's say, saving people money. Or it's reducing regular ground level air pollution. At the same time, it's reducing greenhouse gases. I think a lot of what you do is to put a bright spotlight on co-benefits. And the science shows that they're not quite everywhere, but they're in many places. And the co-benefits often suggest that it's much more like Max than like diet.
So transitioning from marketing Pepsi to the fact that you're the #1 cited legal scholar on Earth, somebody told me yesterday. Is that true, by the way?
Well, there's a recent study that suggests for per page written, I'm the least cited law professor on Earth.
So speaking of your 30th book, is that right?
Maybe.
Maybe? According to a study that was not very comprehensive, Cass has written at least 30 books. This is the new one. He has not seen a copy of this. You are all going to go home with a copy of this today, thanks to Cass.
So you're going to get a copy before I do. It's not formally published yet. And the pictures are amazing. Okay.
I was reading it last night. I don't recall a single photo.
The pictures are amazing.
Okay. So one question that often comes up when you talk about how change happens, I think everyone is asking themselves this question today, and that is when you watch these young people march, when you reflect in the hallway about the difference between an environmental movement and the same-sex marriage movement very recently. When you think about Supreme Court decisions, you think about these times in history when really big change has happened. What's the link as a scholar between, and as a citizen who's watched very carefully, between the individual behaviors that people take and the movement that we eventually celebrate having arrived that turns into policy? What comes first, a movement or policy? What comes first, behavior or legislation?
Usually it's a movement, isn't it? So if you think about the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Acts, the various ones, it was Martin Luther King was probably the principal movement leader, but he couldn't do it by himself. It took much more than a village. And if you look at the astonishing environmental achievements of the last 50 years or so, and in the midst of environmental challenges, we often overlook the achievements. The Clean Air Act is, in terms of human health benefits, it is one of the great enactments in human history, really. And it became possible because states and localities were pressing hard both at the citizen level and eventually at the government level for policies to reduce ground level air pollution like particulate matter and ozone. And after the states and localities started acting, then the national government was actually pressed not only by environmental proponents, but also by companies who said the states are going crazy, help us, preempt them, do something. And that's how we got the Clean Air Act. So the fact is that in a democracy, and even to some extent in nations that aren't democratic, a single person standing in front of a tank, as in Tiananmen Square, who inspired many people, or a single person who, I understand, helped organize the climate marches in Europe very recently. Single people can do things once there is organization. Now, there have to be leaders who are responsive, but one thing I saw in my government role was that members of Congress care about one thing as much as anything else. Do you know what that is? Getting reelected. And if they fear that there's a host of citizens who don't want them to oppose, let's say, measures, then the likelihood they will themselves oppose measures is reduced dramatically.
So I want to build on that. I'm going to ask just two quick questions, and then I think we want to hand it over to the audience. These are both really about the beginning of the book and the end of the book. And in the beginning, you talk a little bit about what happens when a norm changes and what's required. One of the most interesting bodies of research that I've seen recently is about dynamic norms. And the research, Sparkman and Walton on Stanford's campus did this incredible experiment where they showed just people walking into a cafe, if they are told 30% of Americans have already started to eat less meat, their meat purchases went down 50% subsequently. Is there a potentially magical power to dynamic norms?
It looks like it. So one thing we've known for a long time is that if people think the norm is of a certain kind, they're by and large more likely to move in its direction. So if people think that in most public buildings people don't smoke, put the law to one side. If they think the norm is no smoking, the likelihood that they will smoke goes down dramatically. If people think that to engage in, let's say, discriminatory behavior is abhorrent, that's the norm, the likelihood of discriminatory behavior isn't zero, but it's a lot lower than it otherwise would be. So one way to motivate behavior change is to draw attention to an existing norm. What you're pointing to is more recent and I think even cooler, which is that even if the existing norm isn't quite ideal, if there's movement in the direction of a new norm, if there's an emerging norm, and people are told of that increasing numbers of people are doing the following, then people are really drawn to that because they don't want to be on the wrong side of history, I think, and they don't want to look tomorrow like a jerk or like a loser. And so to draw attention in the area of environmental protection and climate change, this is perfect, really, where the norms are shifting, maybe not as speedily as some would like, but they are shifting. And to point to particular people, the norm is going in that direction, that actually is an accelerant.
The end of the book closes with somebody named Sugar Man. Tell us about Sugar Man.
Okay, so Sisto Rodriguez was a rock singer of what many people thought was immense talent, but not of great fame. He did 2 albums, as they were called, and they tanked. He was a different kind of tank man. Sorry, Mr. Rodriguez. His music wasn't very popular, and then he became a construction worker in Detroit. Little did he know, in South Africa, he was the Beatles. He was the Rolling Stones. He was Bob Dylan. And in South Africa, people would say Rodriguez with the same reverence with which some of us say Bob Dylan. And they didn't know what happened to him. His records were a phenomenal success. Now, there's a movie about Sugar Man, as he was called, about searching for Sugar Man. What happened? Why in South Africa was he a giant? Why in the United States was he unsuccessful? And the simple answer is that he caught a wave in South Africa. He had a bunch of people, not that numerous, but numerous enough, who were listened to by others who said, this guy's great. And that produced what's the equivalent of a movement, which is he became a giant. And I think causes are a lot like that. Some causes are like Rodriguez in South Africa. Others are like Rodriguez in the United States. And often the difference we think is some deep cultural fact. South Africa's like this, the United States like this. Or we think that there's a historical inevitability, that this was bound to happen. But neither of those is typically true. More, it's a spark that catches other sparks at exactly the right time. And the fact that the United States became a world leader in environmentalism has a lot to do with sparks, some of which were done by people who never make it in the history books. In fact, most of them were people who were sparked and sparking, who were never in the history books. But the fact that thousands of people are alive today, and I mean literally today, and healthy today, is a result of those people who live in unmarked graves.
Sparks, norms, and the Sugar Man from Cass Sunstein. Let's take some questions. I'm just going to shout it out. Chris here in the front row, and Toby.
Thank you so much. First, isn't there a real danger on a shifting dynamic norm? Because you look at what's happening with parents and vaccines, for example, the norm appears, even though tiny, the norm appears to be shifting, unlike this microphone, which appears not to be working. The other one, I've always wanted to ask you about availability cascades. You coined the term, and we're living in a world of availability cascades where we're showered with messages, showered with high frequency, high volume messaging that could possibly have really bad side effects. So my question to you about that is, does it only work if you want to believe the messaging, or do you find evidence that it actually changes minds in an availability cascade?
Okay, so an availability cascade is when there's one incident or event which spreads from one person to another and it radically changes a whole population's view about the magnitude or existence of a problem. So you could have a case where there's, let's say, Flint, Michigan created an availability cascade where the problem of unsafe drinking water in Flint captured national attention and put a bright spotlight on the problem of unsafe drinking water. Now, a lot of people who are more than alarmed, they're inflamed by the problem of unsafe drinking water in Flint, Michigan. You can't tell what political party they belong to. They don't think citizens should be drinking dirty water or getting sick. And that suggests that whatever your prior ideology, if there's an incident which seems probative that there's a big problem out there from which people are getting sick, you can motivate people across a wide range of views. You're clearly right that you could draw attention to an emerging norm that isn't a very good one, and that could motivate behavior change which isn't really desirable. And so the tool of use of emerging norms or use of automatic enrollment in something, it can be used for good or not so much.
Toby, and then just raise your hand so we can get a microphone going right here down front.
Thank you. Toby Park. I lead the energy and sustainability work at the Behavioural Insights team in the UK. Thanks so much for being here, Cass. So clearly transformative change happens around the world on a regular basis, but engineering it and deliberately achieving that is a different question entirely. And of course, nudges can and often do have quite a modest impact. Of course, there are exceptions to that, defaults perhaps, the sort of iconic big impact nudge, and we can obviously use that in our space here. We can default people into green energy tariffs or into sustainable pension funds and so on, and that could be quite transformative. But I think by and large, nudges tend to have relatively modest impacts. And so I'm constantly aware that we need to, as behavioural scientists, find the bigger levers for change, whether that's sort of more behaviourally informed regulation or taxation that really sort of shifts the market in a way that is not currently happening through conventional regulatory means. So I'm just curious what your views are in terms of where those big levers are, but specifically as behavioural scientists, what can we do to help pull at those bigger levers?
Okay, so it's a great question. If we think of a policy toolbox, this is, things that governments can do, but they have analogs for private actors and for individuals. One is a nudge, a GPS device. Another is an economic incentive, which could be a subsidy or a fine or a tax. A third would be a mandate. where you must recycle, and a fourth would be a ban, like a prohibition on certain kinds of pollutants, which we observe. I think I'd be very careful before saying one of those is more impactful than another. A ban that is never enforced might have hardly any impact. And if I give you a penny, if you reduce your greenhouse gas emissions by 50% next year, that's an economic incentive. It's probably not going to have a very big impact. The idea that nudges have a small impact, some have a small impact, but much of what is done by a policy tool, the impact is, in the scheme of things, relatively small. Better is good. In terms of the repertoire of tools for addressing climate change, all of the ones just discussed are relevant. Clearly, it is the case that the private sector can make pledges or commitments to reducing greenhouse gas emissions by X%. And if it's a company that is responsible for a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, that can be a very significant reduction. I saw, to my surprise, in the US government, a lot of private sector entities which have major resources behind them saying, we want to do things about climate change, and we're going to, regardless of whether the government asks us to. And they're the magnitude either driven by reputational concerns, the company doesn't want to look like a big contributor to the problem, or by a sense that the market is moving away from, let's say, coal and towards either renewables or natural gas. That can be a motivator also. I guess the Paris Accord, imperfect to be sure, along multiple dimensions, but the Paris Accord signaled a kind of all of the above strategy for use of greenhouse gas reduction approaches. And that's probably the way to go. It's very hard to say in the abstract which is best. And the fact that some of the imaginable approaches look like diet, meaning they have a kind of punitive quality, may make them less feasible than other approaches that look like max.
Let's go right here.
Does it just turn on? Okay. First of all, thank you so much for the book. That's awesome. In general,
you've seen the pictures, yes?
Oh yeah, they look great. In general, I'm just wondering from like a social behavior perspective, if you could touch on the ethics of visibility and what like a savior complex looks like in this conversation specifically.
Okay, great. So in terms of nudging, there are a few things that emerge. I've actually surveyed with collaborators people in 17 countries, including China and Russia, as well as Germany, Italy, the United States, Canada. And I won't give you the full list. Korea's on the list, and South Korea, not North Korea. And one thing, the reason for the surveys was to think, what are people's ethical commitments here? And what emerges basically globally is that the kinds of tools that we're discussing, that is information, reminders, warnings, default rules, use of social norms, people are very upbeat about them. In all the countries we studied, a little less upbeat in Hungary than in Germany, but not a lot less upbeat. Hungary, for reasons that are unclear, slightly less, but basically upbeat. And the ethical restrictions that seem to kick in are if the citizen thinks it's inconsistent with their values or their interests, then the hackles go up on their spine. Then they think, we don't want that. Or if the citizen thinks this is the government's effort to protect itself and not us, people don't like that. People seem to care about transparency. That emerges less clearly from our data, but it does emerge more clearly from what we know about governments in general. So all of the strategies we've discussed, automatic enrollment in green energy, or invoking social norms to try to move behavior, or telling people that there's money to be saved as well as environmental protection to be had through this route, or having labels that are environmentally clarifying. All of these are big time transparent, so they don't run into that obstacle. If people feel manipulated or duped, you could generate an environmentally friendly nudge that people wouldn't like very much because they'd feel tricked. And that's why openness with the public is respectful. It's kind of minimally what government officials owe citizens. It's also in government's interest because you'll be kicked in what is technically called the rear end if you are not open.
Technically speaking. We're going to have time for one more question. Alan Modell, you're up. Can we have a microphone right down here?
Your Sugarman example, which I only now have heard about, so I don't know about, is a kind of retrospective analysis that tells us that things we assumed might cause fame don't necessarily cause it. What do you learn from that that makes the likelihood that our environmental song will get a South African reception rather than a US reception?
Okay, so one of the great behavioral scientists, Amos Tversky, said he's an optimist. And the reason he's an optimist is that it's rational to be an optimist, because if you're pessimistic, you suffer twice. Once when the bad thing happens, and once when you think about it. If you look at the arc of environmental history, let's call it, it provides tremendous reason for optimism. And I could go into numerous examples. I'll give you just one, which is there was a time not so long ago when the destruction of the ozone layer looked like an insuperable problem. It was global. The United States was the principal contributor. Getting rid of ozone-depleting chemicals seemed technically extremely challenging and economically really hard. And a few years after, much of the world, and especially the United States, the principal contributor, was ridiculing the idea of doing anything about the ozone depletion problem, it was basically solved through the Montreal Protocol. There are continuing challenges, so you have to put the word basically there, but basically solved. And the president who pushed for the Montreal Protocol was Ronald Reagan, accompanied by Margaret Thatcher. And these are not thought to be the great heroes of environmental protection, but in this area they were heroes. And it had to do with sparks, it had to do with experts, it had to do with analysis, and it had to do with a wave. With respect to ozone depletion, we had Rodriguez in South Africa. And for all the challenges of climate change, if you look where we are in 2019 compared to where we were in 2001, it is an extraordinary leap forward, and it's accelerating.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Cass. We are now